engagement is really centered around regeneration. We got very experienced speakers, if I say so myself. The only change is only one speaker won't be making their presentation. But with that being said, Katie, may you please flight mm, the minutes from the last session and then the agenda, and then we will be off and begin the session. Yeah, with that being said, thank you all for joining, and please enjoy the session. As always, please do look at the emails just so that we can ensure that we have the correct details for everyone, and also to ensure that everyone is accounted for. Also, just a note, does anyone know Andre Lowe? Oh, he's in the call right now. Andre, we see here we don't have an organization and email listed under your name. Are you able to just type that into the chat so that KT can do due diligence and just put that information in for you? Thank you. Okay, thank you for that, Katie. Just any thumbs up or no reaction, just to adopt the minutes, or if anyone has any comments to raise regarding the minutes, this is your time to do so. I will take silence as an adoption. Okay, from my side, the only apologies is from Michaela Donaldson. Any other apologies, please make use of the chat box just to list any apologies from your end, from any participant in the meeting. And yeah, on my side, only Michaela sent her apologies. And yeah, so to start off the session today, I think it was important to have a, you know, overview type of presentation since, next month the G20 summit will be happening from the 18th. So I think it's really important to start getting professionals, from a high level perspective, but also people who've been on the ground to just share their lessons. So the first speaker has actually already opened up their camera, but it's Mr. Monty Narsoo from the Department of Human Settlements. He is a governance advisor at the National Upgrading Support Program. He's a development consultant. He was the Deputy General at the National Department of Housing, the Chief Director of the Gauteng Department of Housing. He was the first CEO of the South African Cities Network, and he's got an extensive knowledge of South African government housing policy. He's got exposure to international best practice in urban renewal and addressing spatial, economic, and social dysfunctionalities. These include informal settlements upgrading in Brazil, Peru, Argentina, and Chile, inner city upgrading in the United States, France, Brazil, and Peru, and new town developments in France and China. He's also he also was the General Secretary at the Johannesburg Municipal Combined Employees Union, And he's also run housing policy and and he's also run a housing policy and development course at the University of Witwatersrand. So he's definitely a professional and an expert in the field. Since obviously you've already familiarized yourself with his face, I'm just going to bring him in, Mr. Monty. Please feel free. Am I still floating your presentation for you?
Yes, please,
Let me
Katlejo.
just unmute him. I
Just one
think you're muted,
correction.
Monty.
Just one correction. I'm now an independent development contractor, so I no longer
Um,
uh, work.
is this audio? Okay, perfect, perfect, perfect.
Okay. So, can you guys hear me?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
So, just the correction is that I'm no longer the NASP governance advisor, but an independent contractor.
Okay, okay. My apologies for that. Am I still flighting your presentation?
Yes, please.
Okay, perfect, perfect, perfect. Let me just do that for you.
Okay. The reason why I called it spaces, places, and people, it's simply because that's what precinct practitioners actually get their almost their terms of reference around what they have to do in those particular places. But if you go to the next slide, um, yeah. So, in overall terms, I think very importantly, what I did and what many people did that worked at precinct level was to understand a whole number of issues and what kind of frameworks we're working in. There's been a lot of talk about how do we get a bottom-up approach to making decisions around planning, around implementation, around upgrading, around regeneration. And sometimes we forget that the other side of the coin is what is the nature of the state, which I'll talk about a little later on. But by and large, what I end up with, and it's not going to be a long presentation, what I end up with is asking key questions, and I have some opinions around it. But the questions are for precinct managers, and I'm not talking only of precinct managers um, outside of the state or outside of government, but also including people that are part of communities, and many of them are their own precinct managers, and also people that are in NGOs. So I think it's quite important that we ask these questions because they very often are problems related to us not understanding what the problem is and rather going for the solution. So uh, that's what my presentation in overall terms is about. So it's about governance and governability, formality and informality, and policy and program imperatives. And I end off with a number of questions. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, you've got my bio from Katlejo, and I think we can just look at a couple of things. One is um, being involved in government. Obviously, I dealt with policy, legislation, programs, and regulations as both a deputy director general and as a chief director. Part of the issues related to my tenure with the South African Cities Network is about knowledge and evidence and analysis and how we share this. And it's quite important that many of us find ourselves in a position where we do the knowledge gathering either from the bottom up or through demographic analysis, etc., etc. And where does this go to? And that's one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves. In the pre-democratic period, I also represented Sanko at the National Housing Forum. And then there was a lot of issues that I dealt with in relation to, and I won't deal with the governance issues, but with accreditation was we were looking at how we can devolve powers down to local government level, particularly the housing function, and we had to do it in a variety of different ways, looking at different capacities, looking at what the legislation says, what the constitution says, etc., etc. And in retrospect, I find that it might have been a mistake given the state of a local government, which I'll talk to briefly around that as well. Informal settlements has been something that I've been involved in for many, many, many years. And some of the stories about how dire the circumstances are in formal settlements, etc., was almost in a sense countered by the incredible creativity, innovation, and hope, and just the joy of life within those settlements. And some of the best times I've spent have been in those informal settlements, both locally and elsewhere. The anti-corruption thing has been going on for ages, and I was part of an anti-corruption project. And one of the problems that we had with that was when that tender came up for renewal, we were asked, is there anything you can give us because we're thirsty? So that was quite a crazy thing. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Okay, I think it's quite important. And I remember that when I was part of the anti-apartheid movement and part of NGOs before 94, one of the crucial things was, did we understand what the state was, what it was doing, etc.? And I remember afterwards when I was in government and we had a meeting with academics and with NGOs, we had to make the point is that post 1994, our understanding of government was less than pre-94. And I think it's quite important that we need to understand the nature of the state. So the first point I want to make is that what was central to the post-apartheid state was the Constitution, which entrenched rights as a basis, and resulting in the state making the judiciary an important player in the development area, because our Bill of Rights goes beyond just merely rights, but also social and development imperatives. The other issue at the time, and as we developed, was the state was very conscious of the issues relating to the backlogs caused by apartheid. So in the first RDP document, the RDP white paper, we had a number of targets. So for instance, there was 1 million houses in 5 years, 2 million water connections, etc., etc. And these targets were primarily as a result of dealing with apartheid backlogs. And one of the issues that has confronted us in recent times has been the issue is, were those targets reacting or responding to what people actually wanted? So the demand side. Now, what we also had was this, I'd say, tension. One of the issues, and I remember I wasn't so happy about it, but in retrospect, it was probably right, is that Treasury throughout the years tended to base itself, particularly in relation to finance management, on rules. That there had to be proper rules in place through the Public Finance Management Act and the Municipal Finance Management Act. And that was aimed at financial prudence, obviously. And as we note with all the recent commissions, that is a very, very important issue. But that caused the tension because the post-apartheid government almost always said it was a developmental state. So on the one hand, you have the rules-based issues, which some people call the Weberian state, which is after Max Weber, the German philosopher, on the one hand, and the practice of a whole number of emerging governments in the last 50 years or so around being developmental. And those things would usually clash. Then the state, in trying to understand what's happening in communities, then in, instituted the IDP process. But that IDP process kind of evolved into merely being a tick box. And although its intention is to be about bottom-up planning, bottom-up decision-making, it became quite a big issue of how well it was done and whether it actually happened. And I'll come back to that again when we talk about some of the tensions. Can we go to the next slide, please, Lethu? Okay, the other issue, and it's an issue that many of us have to face. And I'm using the term precinct practitioners in its broadest sense. With formality, you have to have a set of rules that are widespread. So that's the legality side. It has to be uniform and it must apply across the board. So it has to be widespread, it has to be uniform, and it has to be replicable. While that is the case, as I would say later on, is that what is actually happening with both legislation at national level, legislation at provincial level, bylaws, etc., etc. And then obviously there's the issue of law and order, the whole issue, whether it ranges from, and I'll talk about that more, but it was about making sure that we had stable communities and that there's proper policing, etc., etc. We know all the issues related to that, whether it is in the courts or whether with the latest Madlanga Commission, we're dealing with that issue, if that is actually something that the state is capable of. When we talk about legality, it's about formal transactions, so security of 10 years a title deed. You have to have licenses. You have to pay taxes. There's a whole set of uses around land use management, etc. And so this is how the state says we have to deal with things. So if there's any informal issues, formalization is the go-to thing, because particularly around taxes. With informality, and I think this is a very important issue, because I think there's a general expectation in government that informalities may not be good. But informality is about locally based relationships. You know, who's going to be your child minder? Is it your grandmother, your gogo, while you go to work? It's about whether you can go to your neighbors. It's about the relationships at those levels. And the transactions are socially dominant. Very often, rental, for instance, um, how how one deals with lending from neighbors, etc., etc. Then there's the issue of land occupations or invasions. And one of the issues around that is that has happened pre-1994 as people urbanized, as our cities and our towns became more urbanized, your backlogs grew bigger, your issues of land became a very important issue. Um, and so people occupied land or invaded land. And then there's, as we know, I think most of you are Joburg based, there's quite widespread informal trading. Um, there's an issue that I don't really deal with, but the issues around informality is also issues relating to familial relationships. So that's in the family. But also we find that there are certain parts of Joburg that are called, for instance, small Somaliland, or certain parts of Hillbrow that have a dominance of people that are from outside of the country. And that feeds into another issue, which I don't deal with, but that's the issue of xenophobia, or the issue of we've been overwhelmed by foreigners who are who are taking away some of our services, etc. I don't deal with that. I think it's a whole separate issue. But I think the point I'm making in relation to that is that is that that relationships are not only locally based, but might be related to where you come from, which clan you belong to, etc., etc. So those are some of the aspects around informality, and how we understand that becomes an important decision-making process. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, yeah, deal with the tensions around governance and governability. Now, there's a wide belief that the state is weak, okay? And I think it's quite important that we understand that that is reflected by the recent report that the Auditor General gave to the uh, COPTA meeting, and particularly around local government and service delivery failures is something that we've all faced with in the various metros, etc., but also elsewhere. And I think that has a very important implication for how we work. Then there's the inconsistent application of the law, uh, and that has an impact when you're dealing with social transactions. And And that also gets further uh, exacerbated by state incapacity, because understanding social transactions, understanding what's happening on the demand side, understanding what's happening in communities becomes a real issue around capacity. And if we don't understand those cultures and those social practices, sometimes our interventions are going to be very misdirected. And then part of the reason for state incapacity has been underpinned by corruption. Now, why am I saying incapacity and corruption? I'm saying that because very often the people who are hired or promoted are connected. Okay, so you'll have a 22-year-old chief of staff, for instance. Um, a lot of people, because of corruption, have left government, you know, and have returned and have returned either to the private sector or very often have joined NGOs, or, which is quite an important issue, is they've just said, okay, I'm just going to uh, not do any work and go into retirement. So there's a whole cadre that has left government, um, and I think it's a very important issue of why is it not a great idea to be in government at the moment. I mean, obviously there's internal issues, and I'll come to that when I ask a number of questions. And that's related to the loss of professional capacity in the state. Uh, the whole issue of NGOs' incapacity is a result of a variety of different things. In the beginning, there was a major loss of NGO capacity after '94, when people went into government. A lot of people that were in NGOs became quite senior in government. The other issue is then usually donors, and particularly foreign donors, began to shift their priorities. And this has become a major issue in the health sector now, that the cutting by the US of major donor funding has impacted on NGOs working in the health sector. Then we have the issue of, so understanding NGOs, what their role is, etc., is also an important issue. Very often we just speak of the community as a single entity, and communities aren't single entities. Communities are sometimes fragmented. There are various different interests within communities. And unless we understand quite deeply what those dynamics are, whether it's cultural dynamics, whether it's social dynamics, whether it's family dynamics, it becomes quite important. The other part of it is communities tend to get mobilized around single interests. So the broader issues of a vision for the city, or a vision for a precinct, or vision in provincial terms, is not their primary objective. And I understand that. Last week I was without water for 3 days. So the issue is, yes, it's driven by a particular set of circumstances. Now, there's also another issue which which is an issue which causes a dilemma, after having said all of the above things, is there's an antipathy towards professionals by both the state and communities. And that goes back years. I remember in my time in Sanko that we wanted to know why the money is going to NGOs who are mainly professional people and why isn't it coming directly to communities. Um, the state has said very often at various levels that outsourcing and that consultants are not part of what they want to do. But nevertheless, in my experience, in particular the last 3 or 4 years, is there still a reliance on professionals. So there's this kind of relationship which has both good parts and bad parts to it. That it's a love-hate relationship in essence. You know, you can't do without them, and but you don't like them. Um, so that those are some of the tensions, and the reason why I'm raising these tensions, I think it's important because these tensions impact very fundamentally how do we understand the state, how do we understand the communities, how do we understand our roles, um, and how do we understand where we fit into the bigger picture. And I think that becomes quite important in terms of what decisions we take in relations to what we do. But I'll ask the questions later on. Can we go to the next slide? Now, this slide is very busy, but it's about spaces. And what are the policy imperatives and what are the programs? And I'm not going to go through it in detail, but what I'm trying to indicate here is that there are certain policy imperatives and there are certain programs. So your policy imperatives are, this is in overall terms, which sometimes gets translated into legislation. This is in overall terms what we want to do. Then we put in place a set of programs. And when I'm talking of we, it's whether it's done at the state level, whether it's done in other issues outside of the state, but programs are put together. So, for instance, if one is dealing with the CBD, you're looking at urban regeneration, you're looking at multifunctional road nodes. In many instances, your CBDs, despite the fact that you have a Santon, still contains quite a large tax revenue base. Okay. The CBDs are traditionally seen as economic growth, but in a lot of the cities, they're degenerating. And CBDs are also very important property markets. And often there's been an argument that say CBDs and suburbs are too expensive and the poor can't get into that. There's a counter argument to that that says unless we've got enough tax revenues, we can't cross subsidize to poorer areas. In general terms, our suburbs basically are a lower density. And although there's still a further need for what racial integration, uh, very often your suburbs are low density, and that has an impact on your transport routes, etc., etc. So we've got to address those issues. Um, so and I go through townships and issues of backyarding, etc., etc., issues of spatial restructuring, and many of us have looked at issues related to social to social housing, public rental. For instance, recently, a friend of mine had done an analysis of what's happening in Braamfontein, and I think it's quite important that we understand the demographics, and the demographics are student accommodation. And not only student accommodation, but students who have disposable income. Well, not during Mampara week, but usually at the beginning of the month and towards the end of the month. So here's a number of programs, here's a number of policy imperatives. And when dealing with your precinct planning, it becomes quite important that one takes into account what are the policy imperatives and what are the programs. And it's quite interesting, and I've said this before. If one looks at Newtown and compares it to Braamfontein, for instance, in Newtown there was major local government investment and other investment, and there was also talks of major investment around the government precinct. In and I don't know if any of you been to restaurants in Newtown recently. They're not working. They've got very little custom. There was very little public infrastructure at one stage in Braamfontein, but because Braamfontein, yeah, it was mainly about crime and grime, and more recently, there's been people that are taking major initiative there. But the interesting thing is, Braamfontein worked because some of the people that ran the restaurants and bars and clubs there understood the demographics of the place, which included the pricing, etc., etc. Which goes back to my point with precinct planning. Besides understanding the social dynamics, you need to understand the demographic dynamics, and you've got to understand those microeconomies, and that becomes a very important issue in relation uh, to how we look at local areas, almost at project level, because dealing with precincts is about dealing with projects, and projects are about seeing what you can leverage, both in understanding the policy imperatives and seeing what you can get out of the program. So it's about begging and borrowing. I won't use the word stealing because I think we all know that that's very prevalent. So it's about begging and borrowing. And I remember someone who was involved with the Alexander upgrading project. And I don't know if many of you know the term to smosing. To smose is to go around trying to get various resources or to sell various things. And for her, that was one of the important issues around the kind of project coordination of the upgrading program there. So I think that's quite important around understanding precinct planning. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so what's the meaning of this? And this is a set of questions because if I understood Katlego properly, that much of your forum is about interaction and iteration and that kind of thing. And I think it's quite important that we ask ourselves some very pertinent questions. Okay, so what are we saying? We're saying that in the previous slides, we dealt with the Constitution, which is court decisions, mainly interpreting that Constitution. We're dealing with legislation, we're dealing with policy, and we're dealing with programs. But what does this mean for project and precinct planning and implementation? And I've raised some of the questions early on, but I'm saying there are certain issues that we uh, need to address. Are court decisions seen as progressive? Does that enhance or impede development at the local level? Now, there's one particular issue that BIDs and SIDS are faced with. You know, you've got a situation where court decides that any money that's collected in terms of that has to go to the municipality, and then the municipality pays out. You've got a big problem even in Joburg with its financial problems. But there's other court decisions around evictions, etc., etc. You know, in some instances, the decisions have been good in protecting people's rights. In other instances, it sometimes places a burden on some of the people that are involved in development. You know, for local government, you have to provide alternative accommodation. If you're a private landlord, you've got some court cases that might not deal with issues of whether it's financially sustainable to continue doing what you're doing. Then there's the issue, and you know, I'm saying that it is a given that the local state is weak. But I'm not the only one saying that. The Auditor General said that. Okay. Now that raises quite an important point. Who is responsible for governance and governability at the local and precinct level? Okay. I know Braamfontein well. So now you've got bad boys there. They're responsible for law and order, for the crime issues. You've got issues related to whether people are paying tax, whether they're not paying tax, are people being overbilled? What is the response to government in those precincts? And in my experience, people are not so happy, you know. So who's responsible for governance and governability? Does it become private? Do we, as a constituency, say in a particular area, we will set the rules of what happens or what doesn't happen in our area? Okay. Do we do our own consultations without government and say these are the kinds of things we want? Do we do our own boards for water, etc., etc.? And I think it becomes an important issue when you're dealing at the precinct level. If you've got a weak state, how do you deal with that? Then I've made the point. I've made the point before. You know, local relationships, histories, cultures, dynamics, and practices need to be understood. You know, and it becomes quite an important issue. You know, if you are asked to do a precinct plan, and the question is, what's your terms of reference? And then I raise that later on. What's your terms of reference? How deep can you go? How do you relate to uh, the local communities? Is it financially feasible? And then, are you an intermediary between government and communities? And when I'm talking communities, I'm not only talking of, I'm talking of private sector communities. I'm talking of cultural communities, artists, musicians, etc., etc. And then very often you are stepping on the toes of ward councils who are supposed to deal at that level. So I think it's an important issue we need to address. And then what is the relationship? I've talked about the issue of intermediaries. And it's quite an important issue, and it's come up with people that do, your large auditing firms, where they simply and we've had instances where they simply did what their clients told them to do. Okay, and so how restricted are people by terms of references or tenders or directives? And then that leads to a very important question: is do you say things that are unpopular? You know, if you've got the evidence, where does it lead you to? And more importantly, if you deliver a report that says, these are our recommendation, blah, 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 are you listened to? And I know from my experience with many, many officials in government, their principals don't listen to them. They're asked to do things that are not, that they don't think is right. And that also happens to a whole bunch of recommendations, reports, etc., by consultants that were paid and then go into the government bureaucracy, and nothing is heard about. And there's no implementation in terms of that. Now, I hope this is useful. I know that you very often prefer looking at case studies, etc., which I think is quite important because we learn from them. I've always said you learn more from bad practice than from best practice. But these are some of the questions I have for this audience, and I hope it was useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Monty, for that very, I think everyone can agree, very thought-provoking presentation, based off your experiences. Thank you for sharing that. And just points from my side is just to say, how do we approach the task at hand, in terms of, is the approach to decentralize or is the approach to centralize? Those are just some of my thoughts that I was just thinking as you were speaking, because it seems as though um, the way partnerships are structured might need to be looked at for sure. I'm just going to open up the floor for questions, from anyone who wants to just come in and maybe address a few of the questions you raised, but maybe just also to make a general comment.
Is there no responses?
Yeah, you left everyone speechless, but I think as we continue with the session, there will be more comments. But really, I just wanted to get your thoughts based off of, the experience that you've had in other urban environments in the world. When it comes to, as you said, the weak government and, trying to get a hold of the irregular expenditure, miscellaneous expenditure. What type of solutions have you seen other maybe countries try to implement to kind of regularize the expenditure and maybe, get control of how these tenders or public projects are undertaken? I just wanted to understand, maybe we can get a lesson from another country or just from your experience to say how they approached addressing the corruption.
Well, I think first of all, the issue of decentralization and centralization, I think, is very important. That um, my gut feeling at the time was that the lower you devolve powers and functions, the closer it comes to people. So, for instance, the housing and human settlements function, and which goes together with the planning function, should be at local government level. The problem is that um, what you have is such weak local governments that they can't spend their money, or the money is not administered properly, and that what you have is uh, just a whole range of non-delivery issues. Now, how does one deal with that? Do you centralize or do you decentralize? And I mean, from a principal point of view, you decentralize. From a practical point of view, you need interventions that strengthens capacity and ability to be able to spend budgets, to be able to spend them properly. In terms of uh, different ways of doing different things. Now, I think it's been tried in a couple of places, yeah. But in Rio de Janeiro, what happened is that they actually had a budget for certain precincts. So you had a budget and you decided at that local level with the community, with the private sector, etc., that that portion of that money would be used for these following things. So you can do that. Again, the issue is, if you go back to Treasury, how does one, how is one able to ensure that the money is spent properly? And this came up with the same issue with in the housing field, where there was some organizations in Cape Town that were working on informal settlements. And they were using the example of Malaysia and other places where the NGOs actually got money. And at the time, part of my job as governance advisor, together with colleagues, was saying, but first of all, you have to have in place the proper structures to be able to receive the money, and that we would need some ways of amending the uh, the PFMA, the FMMA, um, and then maybe the money can be transferred. So there was a problem on both sides. On one side is there's very strict stipulations about how money gets transferred. Well, formally, there's very strict regulations. But on the other side, the capacity to receive government money and to spend it, we kept on saying, what are the institutions you have in place? Um, and that is, and we couldn't find that. And so that became a problem. Uh, in relation to to experiences in other countries. The the issue, say for instance, in China, uh, for the Chinese, it was we're going to build new towns, new cities, which is beginning to become a practice in Africa as well, where you actually have very large gated communities. It's also in India where you'd have, say, a Nairobi, but outside of Nairobi is a new town uh, that deals with their own governance, that deals with their own laws and rules, etc., etc. However, in going back to South America, in Peru, for instance, they centralized the issue of upgrading of informal settlements and ran a huge program of titling from the central government level, that whoever was living on a piece of land would get a title. And that title wasn't necessarily a title deed. It was, you can occupy this place. And as a result of that titling, um, although the infrastructure wasn't a major issue, the people that actually the people in those areas, what they did was they started building. It was self-build. It was them providing for their own water, uh, for their own sanitation, etc., etc. And there was investment that was happening there.
Okay. So so essentially, it needs to be a bit of both, in a sense of looking at your local context and seeing what type of framework or model would assist to mobilize the stakeholders on the ground in terms of the goals that they want to achieve. I see Kelvin wants to come in.
Okay, thank you, Monty. Thank you, Katlego. Unfortunately, I joined later. Towards the end of your presentation, there was a mention of Bram, which is the precinct that I manage, and I hope it was in a positive way. However, my comment will be, I am in agreement with the area-based management as different areas, they have different problems. They need different approaches to tackle certain issues. And because the City Improvement District, as they formerly known, they have already set the pattern of area-based management or precinct management. Therefore, it will be good for the city to come in, because we already have a sustainability mechanism, if I can put it like that. These areas whereby if they come in and assist us, because the honest truth, we have taken upon ourselves to do everything that we can do ourselves. However, there are things that we require city to come in and assist. So I think if the city can really put more focus, or let me put it like this, prioritize these areas in terms of resolving the issues within these area-based managed areas, and to set a benchmark, because they know that whatever they come and do in these areas, the city improvement industry will sustain those. Another point is that the issue of ring fencing the revenue. A typical example, there used to be a public parking management company, which will, let's say, for instance, will collect revenue in Braamfontein. But is that revenue that is being collected in that particular area is not reinvested in that particular area. So I think the decentralization, I think that's the best option to deal with some of the issues. Thank you.
Would you like
Thanks
me
for
to
that.
respond?
Yeah, please do respond, Monty.
Yeah, I think, well, I probably know more about Calvin than he knows about me. And from all the reports I've heard, he's doing a pretty good job, having to manage the city and also having to manage people within the area he works in. I think the one point that bothers me, and it's the second point that Calvin raised, and that is, if you belong to a club and you pay subscriptions to that club, so I don't know the details of what the court said, okay, but just is this on top of my head. If you belong to a club and you pay subscriptions, does it have to go via the state for you to for the club to get that? So I mean, it's it. I think it's a very important point that if people in a particular precinct, and now we're talking of Braamfontein, are taking care of their own crime and grime and investment, etc., without the city's intervention, and then they get a court decision. That's why I asked the question. They get a court decision that says, no, it must go via the city. Now, given the financial problems of the city, are you sure you're ever going to get that money back? And I think the idea of ring fencing, so that's not even asking for state or city money to be put in, but the idea of ring fencing what has been collected in a particular precinct should be allowed. Okay. But that's my opinion, and I don't have the law on my side. I think the second issue is there has been, and I understand that there has been quite a lot of engagements between various precincts and CIDs and BIDs with government. The other problem is, but it was with the previous mayor. Now there's a new mayor, then you have to start all over again. So the instability within the state becomes quite difficult. But I would argue that if you understand the economy of various and different precincts, and you want to increase your tax revenue base, your rates base, and then you need to invest in those areas to make sure that increases your revenue. And I think so city interventions has to also be based on the economy. And I'm not arguing that poorer areas shouldn't be a priority, but you've got to balance if you to increase your revenue so that you can cross-subsidize becomes quite an important issue. So those are just my comments around that.
Collen?
Yes, thanks, Katlego, and thanks, Monty. Hello, Monty.
Hey, Colin, how are you?
Very good, very good. And really appreciate the presentation that you've shared. I found that really interesting, especially the part about the role of the state or the city. And you quite rightfully spoke about the city in its current format, where I think we all know and can appreciate, but I think half the time we're not ballsy enough, or we're not Monty Narsoo enough to say it the way it is, just around the issues of weakness, right? Because what you spoke to is how to deal with the weakened state, and I think that's often an area that, at least from some of the institutions that we come from, we're not akin to saying such issues, but it really makes a lot of sense what you're saying. And but I just wonder how much of an acknowledgement needs to happen from within the state to say we see ourselves at this particular juncture, and as a result, this is the sort of help we need. It's almost like what you started off with, right? Like being able to define the problem succinctly enough, right? You can't really help somebody that doesn't know or doesn't acknowledge exactly where they need the help. So just was wondering what's your sense been in terms of this weakened state and the state actually acknowledging its weaknesses, especially not just the city of Joburg, I think broadly within government. And given your various experiences, what has been your take on that self-diagnosis from the city?
Thanks, Colin. I know uh, you know some of the areas I hang out in, and I know some of the areas you hang out in. Look, Colin, I think it's a great difficulty. We tend to, like Joburg's now got a bomb squad, but it's not as effective as the Springbok bomb squad. I think the two issues that you raise. I think there is an acknowledgement of a weak state. But what we see as the weak state is a state at almost the top level. And it's largely influenced by how well they're doing financially. And I think that's one issue. I think the second issue, and remember I said that we've got an exodus of professional people uh, going to other areas. I'm not going to mention you in particular, but I think that at the lower levels where people are too afraid to be able to say, listen, this is what is happening, or to strengthen those areas not at the top level. Someone coming in as a bomb squad is only going to, is not dealing with the bureaucracy as a whole. And again, I know some of the work you're doing in the technical assistance that you're providing. And I think if, and that becomes a very important if we're not simply thinking of an intervention from the top level, but we're saying, why don't you embolden, encourage, first of all, your own staff? Why don't you make sure that they feel that they are dealing with competent people, that they can actually voice what they understand and what they know. And I know many, many, many very good officials too scared to say things. And I think it's quite important that building the institution from the inside becomes quite important. And that becomes important because if people are confident enough, then they don't feel threatened by the professionals they hire. So I think that's very, very important. And Colin, as you know, and you probably know much better than I do, that sometimes the kind of key technical resources that get put in, not at the highest levels, but at a particular level, requires political buy-in and requires you to navigate that process. And I think that that from the side of professionals, that's why I said let's try and understand the state, that that ability to navigate and be able to get the proper decisions becomes quite an important issue.
Thanks for that response, Monty. Very crucial words there. The bureaucracy of things is always something so difficult to really deal with. It's almost like a unsolvable Rubik's Cube. But anyway, Mamba Figile, do you want to come in and just ask your last question?
Okay, thank you very much, Katlego, and good morning. Thank you, Monty, for the wonderful presentation that talks to us as present managers. Bafile from Hillbrow. I heard in your presentation, you just said something about Hillbrow, but you never got into detail. And I like the way you put it in the investments of areas, especially when you pointed out of Braamfontein. And I liked the way you said it. So I'm comparing it now to Hillbrow. And talking of the regeneration of Hillbrow, that has been going on from since 2004, and aligning to it to what you have been saying, I found it having us to get more points and also make use of them. Right. When I come to investment, in Hillbrow, the property owners who are operating in the area where most people are perceiving it a problematic area and a migrant center or whatever, the property owners has managed to actually put a lot of investments there around, joining hands together. And now when it comes to the challenges that Hillbrow is facing, it is around the city. If the city can do what they can do best in their own properties, which are among the area, you will find that the investment will pull very well. But now it is being brought down by the city buildings, which are not taken care of, looked after. So I'm supporting you in how can we bring them in more so that they can really act on them, because that's where the investment is stuck. When you come to bringing together the people of Hillbrow, they are really all in the interest of investing there, making Hillbrow their home and live there. We have got Bad Boys as the best bylaw enforcement, which has been operating there throughout the regeneration. But because of those hiccups and things that the government, the city is not doing right, we're finding it being pulled back. And now we are looking at G20 coming. I think around all those, there are some visitors who will ask you about it, because I've seen that when I'm having the visitors, international visitors coming here, you will won't believe that there's no more than 2 or 3. They will ask you of a certain property in the middle of Hillbrow. And you will see that the interest of Hillbrow is international. And then if we can get that kind of help and really make the investment work, it will be a vibrant home as the property owners have chosen. So our question is around how can we bring the city to do what they are supposed to do? Thank you.
Bafakile, I just want to give you a little personal note. I was born in Doornfontein, which is just down the road from Hillbrow, and I spent some wonderful times there. And so I know the area quite well. I know some of the stuff that's been done now and has been done for a while. I know that, Hillbrow has always been almost like a switchboard into various areas. I mean, going back years and years and years. And I think you're raising two questions, and I agree with you, by the way, because I know Hillbrow so well. There are two questions that you're raising. The one is the neglect of the city in regard to its own properties. Okay. And they have to deal with that. Okay. And it's not only the city, but there might be other properties that belong to government. And I think they must, that intervention becomes quite urgent, because the hijacked properties are impacting on the other investments, as you're saying. So I think that is the one issue. I think the second issue is the issue around investment. And now I'm talking of which I think it's you guys and other people in and around that's been working in the area. You guys have been putting investment into public spaces, into parks, trying to run programs around the youth, etc., etc. That has to be supported by a broader investment in public spaces, and as I was saying, in understanding what's happening socially. That that your parks are safe, that they're properly maintained, etc., etc. So that kind of intervention is quite important. And you're right. You know that Hillbrow is known from wherever I've been to. I remember in Canada, I got stopped at immigration, and this guy said, "Where are you from?" So I told him where I'm from, and he said, "Do you know this building in Hillbrow?" So I said, "Yes, I did." And this is a customs and immigration official in Canada, so it is well known. And people do come for visitors do come there. I think we just need to broaden that out. And what is the city doing about that? That particular brand that's Hillbrow, I think becomes an important question. So by and large, I'm agreeing with what you're saying.
Okay, I think we should leave it there. Thank you for the questions, everyone. And also thank you, Monty, for addressing them so coherently and also presenting a very comprehensive presentation. Anyone wants to reach out to Monty, I will just make sure his email is available for you. But definitely thank you for your time, Monty. I think we have to move to the next agenda item, but definitely please stay around because it's about the new N2 precinct that they're developing. So actually, Collen's gonna come back to present that. Thanks, Monty.
Okay. All right.
Oh,
I'll listen in. Okay, I'm switching my camera off.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so the next agenda item, you've already met the speaker, Mr. Collen Lethu Masango, fellow urban planner, but the only difference is he has over 20 years of experience, worked for the World Bank since 2019 as a senior urban economist, and he's also worked in many different roles in the city of Johannesburg, mainly in the economic development, housing, and development planning departments. And of course, he has a master's degree in development planning from the University of Witwatersrand. So he's also a fellow Witsi. So the floor is yours, Mr. Collen. Sorry for coming into your time a little bit, but hopefully the remaining time is enough for you. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Katlego, and good morning, everybody, again. So yeah, I think a very nice preface having Monty set the scene, which helps me navigate a few issues that I don't necessarily have to cover as I present. But the work that I'm sharing this morning, many of you probably have had an opportunity to experience it, either through the Presidential Joint Working Group, which is focusing on regenerating the inner city of Joburg. This work, though, is specific to M2 City, which I will share as I move along. Just right, and Katlego, of you not seeing the ask from the city of Joburg come in, but if you are, I'll continue talking. The context is that in 2023, the city reached out to the World Bank. The bank had created a facility through the city support program, a facility where various cities could write to us and present their challenge, and we generally responded with providing technical assistance, largely from global partners, so officials within the World Bank or other institutions that we work closely with. And in this case, the city made a very clear appeal that it was about getting support in rethinking its engagement with the inner city and its evident failures. I think at the time, many of you recall, there was the explosion along Lilian Ngoyi, there was the tragedy at Usindiso, and other incidents of fire in the inner city that basically led to significant pressure on this on the city. And part of what we then started doing was just getting a sense of what the city had done over the years. The image that you see over there are the various areas that are covered by the city's existing precincts at the time. But you know, when we went beneath the surface of trying to figure out what was really wrong, we said to the city, let's firstly do a baseline assessment to understand what the regeneration story has looked like in recent years. And if we are to intervene, then we know exactly what the challenge is and how to then intervene. As Monty has indicated earlier on, you really have to spend a bit of time. And I know we all think the problems are adequately defined, right? But I tend to have a different view that it's really when you look at issues from institutional level all the way to what happens at the project implementation stage, that you really then see the challenges that are facing the city. And we did exactly the same in the inner city. So we just looked at or rather, just to summarize the challenges that we saw, was that the decline of services is probably most pronounced in spaces like the inner city, where there is significant overcrowding. And because of that significant overcrowding and the neglect and the capital flight, you really see the collapse of infrastructure such as water, electricity services, etc. Classic example being the BMW garage that's just off the M2, which has closed down in recent years, largely because of cable theft and the fact that the city just had no ways in which to deal with the issue. But the most significant challenge that we picked up was on the city's relationship with the space in the inner city in terms of investment in there. And we referred to this as the shotgun approach, where over the years, whilst the previous slide you saw showed all the precincts, but when you really look at what has happened in terms of investment by the city specifically, it's really so spread out that the impact is very limited, and it's spread out, but also at the same time not in alignment with where the private sector is wanting to put its money or putting its money, right? So it basically just goes into a black hole and doesn't impact much. And obviously then there's the housing crisis, which given all our knowledge of the bad buildings and how it has played out in the inner city, I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But then part of what we then started looking at was that the information that was available to us, or made available to us at the time, was really scant. So from talking from one department who had spatial information that was mapped on and printed out documents and not available anywhere else, we realized that there was a huge information gap in terms of understanding exactly what's happening and where all of this is happening and how to then intervene. So we procured the services of an entity that's quite au fait with issues within the inner city, within the city broadly, given their work on the construction permitting management system. And they were able to reach out to various private sector role players, SIDS, urban space management entities in the inner city, to really start to give us a sense of where the challenges, or rather where the information and data resides, so that we could help the planning process. And then the next activity was then to think about where to invest in the inner city. Now, the bank was brought in not to be the purveyor of all knowledge on urban regeneration, right? But to say, what insights could we give the city on where it could potentially spend its resources? So the city gave us a few of its precincts, asked us to do a prioritization approach. We firstly tried to do it through data, but it wasn't enough, and we went back to traditional planning systems to figure out which of the spaces that were presented to us would best serve the city's interests of showcasing what regeneration really could look like. And so they gave us 3 sites: High Court, M2 City, and then the Hillbrow Health Precinct. Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna go into too much. I've given a very brief highlight of the challenges as we saw, but just I think one important point to make here is that when we then looked at the three precincts in relation to where the city had been spending its money versus where private sector interests seem to have taken place, we realize that Monty, as he was talking about um, Braamfontein, for instance, right, which is just in this area here in the northern part of that's bottom left diagram, is that the investments that have been made and recorded through the urban development zone, which is where the private sector is able to get some rebates from investments made, is that all of this does not correlate with where the city was looking at as areas of potential investment, including when you look at the future outlook in terms of where the city wants to spend its money over the medium term. Again, it just speaks to this issue of a very sporadic approach from various departments that you can't really get a clear picture of where all of the investment is trying to reach. So we then agreed with the development planning department that in order to make any meaningful impact in any of these spaces, you need to transition towards a proper precinct approach, which is not just about where you put your money. Obviously, the city can't just put its money in one space, but when the city puts its money into a particular space, what are the mechanisms that need to be in place for pulling together the various governance issues and ensuring that the infrastructure department and spend is cohesive and results in scalable impact? And then how do you choose one space and in choosing that space, be able to define um, really transformational impact and investment into the space that you've chosen. Now, Hillbrow is somewhat saturated. I know that there's a lot of problems. Previous speaker just spoke to the various challenges as they impact Hillbrow, but the investment in that space would definitely make an impact. But the city was also trying to figure out where its biggest impact would be, right? And it well, all the studies and the inputs that we'd received pointed out to the M2 space as being the most transformational. Now it's the belt along the M2, which I think Monty mentioned this point as well about residential density, that it's an area of high residential density, converting a lot of the industrial buildings largely illegally so. But it offers so much potential because of its nature. It's largely 2 to 3 story walk-up buildings that have the opportunity to be increased quite significantly to match the rest of the inner city. And the city then said that, look, the idea is not to isolate again investment just into M2 city, but to understand how we learn from the space and be able to take the lessons and implement them in other areas. So adjacent to the Jewel City that's recently received significant investments into the High Court space, Hillbrow Precinct, Constitutional Hill, etc. All of those areas lend themselves to learning from what can be done in the space. So what I'm largely going to focus on is how we then worked with development planning in the city at large to reimagine this M2 corridor as a space for transformation. But the key task that we were faced with is how to do this in a rapid timeline. We'd already been engaged for quite some time in galvanizing the city to get to a point where we were ready to roll out our support. And so we looked at issues about how do we unlock practical interventions in the space, but more importantly, given the issue of the broken trust and fatigue stakeholders, how do you find innovative ways to bring people into the conversation towards particular solutions? And that's when we restarted our colleagues in the IT and innovation team in the bank, who helped us with a design sprint, which basically looks at an accelerated decision-making process. It's about the diversity of stakeholders, but how to take those diverse stakeholders and be able to bring them into solutioning engagement. And so we had a number of participants and decision makers from National Treasury, city itself, as well as development partners, DBSA, the development AFD, the likes of SECO and others who basically came into the space. It was about community users and representatives. We had subject matter experts, and many of the colleagues behind this forum were actually in attendance as well. And then obviously the technology and innovation experts. And before we started on the first day, we had what we call the pre-visioning, where in the room with all of those stakeholders that I've highlighted, we were unpacking what some of the key challenges firstly are in the space. We're then bringing everybody on board in terms of having a united approach to what we want to see in the space. But we also broke the conversation down quite a lot, where we were engaged in pointing the finger. So from government groupings to private sector to academia and researchers, pointing fingers at each other as to where they are responsible for the challenges as we see them in the inner city, but then importantly, then being able to transition on what it will take to get us over the finish line. So part of the design sprint, we then went into detailed engagement. I think the first one was around building empathy. Now this is us developing personas of different users in the space to understand their view of the inner city. We didn't have enough time to engage with stakeholders as they are impacted by living in the space. So we used the baseline research to understand issues from their point of view, and broke ourselves up into various groups where we were then prototyping solutions in the space. What will it take to transform M2? So we looked at it from the Eastern Precinct, the Central Precinct, as well as the Western side. Again, people in those groupings being divided across different stakeholder lines so that we could have deliverables that represented a broader view of society of what really could and should happen in those various spaces. And then on the final day of the design sprint, we brought in some of the decision makers that were around on the first day, that we played back what the teams had been able to create within previous 2 days. And this validating exercise was really useful in just helping bring in different voices from individuals that have the resources on what really needs to happen in the space, etc. And you'll excuse me as I'm rushing. I'm also mindful of the time that we will probably have less than 15 minutes to go. So, um, how we've now framed where we are, again, we've divided it into three precinct areas. It's anchored on various elements. So on the western side, for instance, you've got the Maharishi Institute, the Westgate taxi ranks, and the Westgate train station, in which the city has been leading engagements with PRASA on how we could make use of the space to activate it for better interventions. And working with Josie My Josie, we've identified several gateways that they are keenly interested in. So their focus will help us basically leverage a point that Monty raised quite sharply about the ability to leverage various interventions that are active in the space. Gpma, obviously, to the eastern side, is a really important anchor, as well as City Kids in the central area, along with the APSA precinct and others that really lend themselves to transformational interventions that seek to ensure that people make use of the space. So walkways are a very important element of the work that we've done so far. In terms of the priority support areas, as we've been going through this work, we've realized that infrastructure resilience and the type of investments, the financing of that investment is really going to be key. Urban management is arguably the most important intervention that can be made in the space. And so looking at elements around law enforcement, issues of public lighting, and basic cleanup programs that ensure the space is usable. The third one is the biggest headache of the city at the moment on dealing with bad buildings. Now, fortunately, the work that we're presenting is not necessarily just about us, the World Bank, working with the development planning department, but there's the presidential working group, which has all of the touch points on infrastructure, urban management, bad buildings, and the institutional arrangements. So we're basically leaning off those interventions and lifting them to say, how do they then find expression within the M2 precinct? And then the final one on institutional coordination is not just about the city coordinating itself, although we've done some really useful engagement in the past couple of weeks where we've been engaging with all the infrastructure departments or entities within the city about this intervention and how they could play a role or reinvest some of the resources for unspent capex in the M2 space. But I think the final point to make around this is just on the issue of leveraging the private sector and making sure that all of the projects that are being proposed are aligned to what the private sector is doing in all of those spaces. So, Katlego, I really am mindful that we have 8 minutes now. So I'm not going to go into the details of some of these conversations that we've had with the city departments, but we've been fortunate because we've engaged with almost all of them, save for a few sessions that had to be postponed. But there's been valuable input into how they would contribute into making the M2 city the test bed moving forward. So from human settlements to social development, who pointed out issues related to the availability of services in the area, etc., human settlements and their expansion in terms of social housing and so on. All of these players were able to make significant inputs, and we continue those engagements. I'll pause here where we're basically outlining an implementation approach from a 90-day focused intervention. So the 90 days is largely the stakeholder engagement that we've been participating in. But I think the most important intervention under the first phase is getting this precinct onto the development planning department's capital capital plans over the next 3 years. And that is already on track, and hoping that by March 2026, the city actually goes out on its IDB drive, and this is already captured as a key project of the next TRAF expenditure. The next phase on quick wins, I think I've mentioned a lot of the areas related to urban management, which needs to be undertaken over the next 12 months from January up until we got months completely wrong. Excuse me for that. And then the final one would be the flagship projects. So the key infrastructure investments, but also interventions around road closures, private investment in the space around social housing, and other key flagship projects that the city should continue to seek through engagement with the private sector. Collen, I'll pause it there. I had a couple more slides, but I'll happily share these so that colleagues can engage and hopefully make input into the process and help us enrich the work that we're doing. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Colin. Great presentation. Definitely, I think I heard it at the other presidential working group meeting, the human settlements one, and definitely a lot of research has went into understanding the different precincts. I think this is just to link to Monty in terms of just to say like the design sprint was such a great idea, in my opinion. I think that approach can be replicated for other areas where it's just a quick stakeholder session engagement. People come together and then move with a shared vision. My question is around the bureaucracy of things. I hear you say, obviously, there's urban management that needs to be prioritized, but in your work, are there any pushes for policy reform or changing how um, essentially the different stakeholders interact and partner above and beyond just coming together and co-investing?
So is there a big push around institutional arrangement? Is that what you...
Yes, essentially.
Yeah,
I say, yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was saying this because just as Calvin alluded, sometimes with the existence of a CID, it does make the city feel as though they can just give the majority of the urban management work to the CID. But I'm just trying to understand, are there any provisions you guys are making to kind of look at how policies set up, how partnerships are set up to kind of make partnering with the city easier, but also beneficial for both sides?
Yeah, no, again, I think a function of rushing that probably did not come out very clearly, that as we undertaking this test bed exercise. That is part of the areas that we're looking at, how this approach can be used to strengthen relations between the city and the private sector and other role players, in fact, not just private sector, looking at DFIs and communities as key solution drivers in any space. Because, I think we've all heard it way too many times, and probably all say it in various settings, that you cannot expect the city to do all of the interventions on their own. But I don't know that there are enough models or fresh thinking on how you help the city get to that point where they've created the right partnership with various players. And this is a practical exercise, which those roadmap, those three areas of intervention or timelines that I was talking to speaks exactly to partnership with the private sector. So yeah, I mean, it's been an integral part of the work that we've been doing, how to help the city bring in partners in a meaningful way.
Yeah, definitely. Because I heard you said obviously the urban management systems is a big one. I just feel like the biggest one is honestly that institutional coordination, just so that everyone's always on the same page and that the framework fits the reality of the weak state, I think needs to be something, on top of mind. But I'll just open up for a few questions and then I think we'll just close the session from there. Obviously, the slides will be shared and I will obviously receive any additional comments from anyone in the network who just wants to put more input into Precinct. Calvin.
Thank you, Collen, for the presentation. This is not my first time seeing this presentation, but I would like to check with you, Collen. Excuse me if my question will be controversial, but I just want to check with you. What informed the selection of this particular area? And the second question, is there already a significant investment in this particular area? Because on the back of my mind, I'm aware there is Standard Bank. I'm not sure other investment in this particular area. Thank you.
Yeah, Calvin, so let me go back to this slide where I started off. Part of what I didn't really explain on here is that when you look at the precincts as defined by the city, just below number 5 there is where Gpma is situated, right? And so part of the conversation that we had with the city was to say, in looking at the various precincts that they currently have on hand, there's various investments, but when you look at number 19, it was largely called the Southern Inner City Belt, which had no specific precinct plan linked to it, right? But then the city then also looked at where there is a transformational impact that can be made. Now, to be able to make a transformational impact, the baseline looked at several factors. One, it looked at existing interventions and investments in specific areas. This precinct consists of the Westgate station, as I mentioned. There's significant private sector investment in the form of the Amarishi Institute located here. You have the Standard Bank headquarters, as you mentioned, as well as um, the ABSA precinct, which is changing format given the residential element that's taken root over there. But I think for for um, for the city, it was always about what is the largest area that a transformation can be made through consolidated investment. And this area, unfortunately, has been neglected in terms of planning interventions for many years, but also just presents so much opportunity. I don't know whether you're familiar with the space, but I made the point that a lot of the buildings in the area have been converted from industrial commercial use into residential activity. If you drive in the space on a Sunday with the various churches that have taken root in the area, you literally cannot find space to drive, right? There's so much energy and movement in some of these roads in this area. So there's a number of factors that led us to this. But I think what the executive director probably framed in many of the conversations is that the investment area needs to be one that sets the tone in terms of accommodating people that are already on the edge of the city or on the edge of um, or excluded rather. They're excluded from economic participation, and this is arguably one of those spaces in the inner city.
Thanks for that, Colin. I will just open up for one more question, just so that we can wrap up, as I know we are over time. Okay, there aren't any more questions. Definitely on my side, I'll just request obviously to just be kept up to date, and also just let me know on your side whenever I need to come in for the policy conversation, because I think that needs to really be prioritized as of urgency, just from a point of view of showing the property owners that the city is willing to bend and make the environment more ideal for them to even have those properties. So please do bring me in those type of conversations. But definitely, if there are any more questions for Colin, please do send them through. And I will obviously go and send them to him and engage to see if there's more engagements that need to happen. Maybe Colin, you and Monty can have a conversation. You see, like he had very valuable inputs. I can share his presentation with you as well. But yeah, with that being said, um, I'll bring the session to a close. Obviously, the next Urban Practice Forum will be on the 4th of November. And then the next chapter meeting, which is obviously with the Johannesburg Network, will be on the 28th of October. And then obviously, as you know, G20 next month. I'm gonna try and get an open invite for our network, but I'll keep you all posted on that. And as always, please do look at the chat box. There are links to all our social media platforms where you will be able to access more up-to-date updates, news, event invitations, so on and so forth, newsletter links. So please do go check in the chat box and familiarize yourself with our social media platforms. But with that being said, thank you to our speakers today. I think it was a very dynamic session, and thought provoking more than anything. And yeah, please do enjoy the rest of your day, week, and month. And as I said, we will keep in touch and share updates. Please do send through your questions. And yeah, thank you all for attending. I will just bring the meeting to a close.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Lethu. Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.